Night settles heavily over the Solomon Sea. The jungle breathes in the dark, thick and wet, pressing toward the shoreline as if listening. Somewhere beyond the reef, a low vibration cuts through the stillness, not the deep churn of a destroyer, but the frantic, uneven growl of 3 Packard engines pushed past their comfort. A small wooden hull skims across black water at 40 knots. Spray lashes the bow. Salt stings eyes already burning from fuel fumes. Then a flash, not the dull thump of a torpedo, but a violent, metallic crack, a cannon blast, sharp and brutal, tearing the night open. For a moment, the jungle lights up. Palm fronds shudder. A Japanese barge erupts in splinters. Men scatter into the water, and then the sound again, too heavy for a boat this small, too violent to belong here. This is no destroyer, no cruiser. This is a patrol torpedo boat carrying a weapon never meant for the sea, a 37mm cannon borne in the nose of a fighter plane. To those watching from the shore, it will earn a name, whispered in fear, and its story begins long before this night. In a war that demanded invention or extinction. By the time the Pacific War entered its second year, the map had already turned against the Allies. From December 1941 through the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire advanced with speed that stunned even its own planners. Hong Kong fell. Singapore collapsed. The Philippines bled. Across thousands of miles of ocean, island after island slipped from Allied control, leaving the United States Navy scrambling to respond in waters it barely understood. The Pacific was not the Atlantic. There were no long convoy lines, no predictable shipping lanes. Instead, there were narrow straits, jungle coastlines, reef-choked channels, and hundreds of small islands where visibility vanished after sunset. This was a war of darkness and distance, and in that environment, traditional naval power struggled to adapt. The U.S. Navy had battleships, cruisers, and carriers. What it lacked, in the early months, was reach at night and presence in shallow water. The Japanese had already mastered both. Imperial Japanese Navy doctrine placed enormous value on night combat. Their crews trained relentlessly in night navigation, optical signaling, and torpedo attacks. The Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, oxygen-fueled, fast, and devastating, gave Japanese destroyers a lethal edge. But beyond formal fleet actions, another kind of war unfolded along the jungle coastlines of New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. It was a logistics war fought in darkness. As Allied air power began to dominate daylight skies in mid-1942, Japanese commanders adapted. Large transports became easy targets, so they turned to smaller craft, barges, fishing vessels, and coastal luggers, moving men, ammunition, and food under cover of night. These resupply missions, later called the Tokyo Express by Allied forces, were not glamorous, but they were vital. Without them, isolated garrisons would starve. The Allies needed a counter. Enter the patrol torpedo boat, the PT boat. Originally conceived in the interwar years as a fast attack craft, PT boats were small, wooden vessels roughly 80 feet long, built for speed rather than armor. Powered by 3 gasoline engines, they could reach over 40 knots in ideal conditions. Their intended role was simple: dash in, launch torpedoes at enemy ships, and escape before return fire could land. On paper, it was elegant. In practice, it was flawed. Early in the Pacific War, PT boats struggled. Their torpedoes were unreliable, often running too deep or failing to detonate. Their crews operated in extreme heat, humidity, and exhaustion. Their wooden hulls, though fast, offered little protection against destroyers or even well-armed barges. A single hit could mean annihilation, yet they had one advantage no larger ship possessed: access. They could slip through narrow channels, hug coastlines, and operate where radar coverage was weak or non-existent. In the shadowed waters around Guadalcanal, Tulagi, New Georgia, and later New Guinea, PT boats became the only Allied presence after sunset. By late 1942, the fighting around Guadalcanal exposed both the potential and the limitations of these vessels. Crews found themselves engaging enemy barges at close range, sometimes within a few hundred yards, where torpedoes were useless and machine guns often insufficient. Japanese barges were small, low to the water, and difficult to hit. They could absorb surprising punishment and still limp away into the darkness. What the PT boats needed was not speed. They already had that. They needed firepower, immediate, brutal, accurate firepower. Improvisation became doctrine. Crewmen began mounting anything they could scavenge onto the decks. .50 caliber machine guns, 20mm Oerlikon cannons, even Army anti-tank guns. Some modifications were authorized. Many were not. Field commanders, faced with nightly combat and rising losses, cared little for regulation. One idea, at first, sounded absurd. If aircraft could destroy armored vehicles and bombers with forward-firing cannons, why not boats? The Bell P-39 Airacopter, a fighter aircraft already seeing service in the Pacific, carried a powerful 37mm cannon firing through the propeller hub. It was heavy. It kicked hard, but it could tear through metal and wood alike. Somewhere between desperation and ingenuity, the idea emerged: take that cannon and bolt it to a PT boat. What followed would permanently change how these small vessels fought and how the enemy feared them, and it would begin not in a design bureau, but in the humid, makeshift workshops of the South Pacific, where necessity overruled doctrine and survival demanded experimentation. The transformation was already underway. The decision to upgun the PT boats was not born in Washington or drafted in neat blueprints. It came from the margins of the war, from mechanics working under palm fronds, from skippers who had watched torpedoes fail and men die, and from commanders who understood that adaptation was the only currency that mattered in the Pacific. By late 1942 and early 1943, the U.S. Navy's motor torpedo boat squadrons were scattered across forward bases in the Solomon Islands and along the New Guinea coast. Places like Tulagi, Rendova, Espiritu Santo, and Milne Bay were little more than muddy anchorages with fuel drums, makeshift piers, and tents soaked by monsoon rain. But they were close to the fight, close enough to hear Japanese artillery at night. Here, experimentation thrived. The first modifications were simple. Extra .50 caliber Browning machine guns were welded wherever space allowed. Crews stripped off torpedo tubes to reduce weight and make room for heavier weapons. The logic was brutal and direct. If the enemy was coming in barges, not cruisers, then a boat built to kill cruisers needed to change its purpose. The most radical change came with the idea of mounting a 37mm cannon. The weapon itself was not new. The M4 and later M9 37mm cannons were originally designed for aircraft like the Bell P-39 Airacopter. In the air, the gun was stabilized by the aircraft's structure and firing arc. On a wooden boat, nothing about the concept made sense on paper. The recoil alone could crack frames or throw the vessel off balance. Ammunition storage was limited. Accuracy on a pitching deck seemed impossible, yet the need outweighed the risks. Reports from PT crews described Japanese barges absorbing hundreds of machine gun rounds and continuing forward. Some were reinforced with steel plating scavenged from wrecks. Others were simply too low in the water to present a clear target. A single high-explosive shell, however, could tear one apart. The first field installations were crude. Cannons were bolted directly to reinforced decks or mounted on improvised pedestals. There were no recoil buffers designed for marine use. Gunners braced themselves against bulkheads and hoped the structure would hold. It often barely did. But, when the first rounds were fired in combat, the effect was immediate and unmistakable. A 37mm shell did not punch holes. It shattered. Barges disintegrated. Crews were thrown into the water. Explosions lit the shoreline like lightning strikes. For the first time, PT boats could dominate an engagement instead of merely harassing. Word spread quickly. By mid-1943, some PT squadrons were being officially refitted into what became known as gunboats. Torpedo tubes were removed entirely. In their place came heavier armament: 40mm Bofors guns, 20mm Oerlikons, twin 50s, and in some cases, the feared 37mm cannon. These boats were no longer torpedo attackers. They were floating ambush platforms. This evolution coincided with a shift in Japanese tactics as well. The Imperial Japanese Navy, stretched thin and increasingly on the defensive, relied more heavily on nocturnal resupply runs. Barges ran close to shore, hugging jungle shadows. Crews learned to move without lights, engines throttled down, listening for the hum of Allied patrols. But the night no longer belonged solely to them. The presence of heavily armed PT boats forced Japanese commanders to reconsider their routes and timing. Encounters grew more violent, more intimate. Engagements often occurred within a few hundred yards, sometimes close enough for shouted warnings or exchanged curses to be heard over engine noise. American crews began to recognize the psychological effect of their new weapons. Survivors reported Japanese troops abandoning cargo, beaching vessels prematurely, or refusing to move until daylight, a death sentence under Allied air superiority. And with that fear came a name in intercepted communications and post-war accounts. Japanese sailors referred to these boats as Akuma no Fune, devil boats, not because they were large or numerous, but because they appeared suddenly, struck with unnatural force, and vanished back into the dark before retaliation was possible. The transformation of the PT boat was complete. It was no longer a torpedo craft waiting for a capital ship that might never come. It had become a hunter, designed for the shadows, tailored for chaos, and driven by crews who knew that survival depended on striking first and disappearing faster than fear could catch them. That reality would shape every engagement that followed, and it would shape the men who fought them. The men who crewed the PT boats were young, often barely out of their teens, and almost always exhausted. Their war was not fought in grand formations or celebrated fleet actions. It was fought in isolation, at night, with no witnesses beyond the jungle and the sea. Life aboard a PT boat was cramped and unforgiving. The air below deck was thick with gasoline fumes and sweat. Engines roared so loudly that conversation became impossible once underway. Sleep came in fragments, often interrupted by alarms or the thud of waves slamming against the hull. There were no safe nights. Even in harbor, Japanese aircraft or artillery could reach them. When the boats went out on patrol, silence became a discipline. Cigarettes were forbidden. Voices were whispers. Every sound carried over water. Crews learned to read the darkness, the shape of shorelines, the unnatural silhouette of a barge, the flicker of movement that didn't belong to the jungle. Fear was constant, but it was a quiet fear, buried under routine. Men focused on tasks, loading ammunition, checking feeds, wiping salt from optics. There was comfort in repetition. Panic had no place in a cockpit made of plywood. The arrival of heavier weapons changed not only tactics, but morale. A 37mm cannon gave crews a sense of parity, even superiority. For the first time, they could strike decisively. They were no longer gnat-stinging giants. They were predators, yet the cost remained high. One direct hit could tear a PT boat in half. There was no armor, no margin for error. Every engagement was a gamble, and everyone knew the odds favored no one. Still, they went out night after night, because someone had to. The transformation of the PT boat into a gun platform was an exercise in battlefield engineering. Nothing about it was standardized at first. Each squadron modified its boats based on available materials, experience, and desperation. The 37mm cannon, originally designed to be mounted along the center line of an aircraft, posed unique challenges. Its recoil could splinter decking. Its weight altered balance. Ammunition had to be stored where it wouldn't shift dangerously in high-speed turns. Crews reinforced mounting points with scrap metal and salvaged steel plating. Some welded braces directly into the deck beams. Others constructed crude recoil buffers using rubber, wood, or even rope. These were not factory solutions. They were field-borne compromises. Despite the risks, the results were undeniable. The shell's explosive force could punch through a barge's hull, detonate cargo, or kill exposed crews instantly. Against wooden targets, it was devastating. Against steel, it was still effective at close range. The presence of such a weapon changed engagement geometry. PT boats no longer needed to line up torpedo runs. They could attack from unexpected angles, fire once or twice, and disengage before the enemy understood what had happened. This flexibility fit the chaos of the Pacific War perfectly, but technology did not exist in isolation. Every innovation forced a counter, and every advantage carried consequences. The boats became louder. The recoil flash gave away positions. Ammunition resupply became a logistical headache, and with heavier armament came increased strain on engines and crews alike. The gun made them stronger, but also more vulnerable. And that balance would soon be tested in real combat. Against an enemy who was learning, just as quickly, from the Japanese perspective. The night war along the coasts of New Guinea and the Solomons became a waking nightmare. Barge crews were often reservists or hastily trained sailors tasked with running supplies under constant threat. They moved slowly, hugging shorelines, cutting engines whenever possible. Their survival depended on silence and timing. Then the attacks began to change. Instead of the distant splash of torpedoes or scattered machine gun fire, there were sudden explosions, precise, violent, close. Barges vanished in seconds. Survivors spoke of blinding flashes and thunderous impacts, of boats that appeared out of nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Rumors spread faster than orders. Some claimed the Americans had new weapons. Others swore the boats were armored, invulnerable to rifle fire. Fear filled the gaps where information should have been. Japanese after-action reports noted a growing reluctance among crews to operate in certain areas. Routes were abandoned, deliveries delayed, entire garrisons went hungry because supply craft refused to sail. The psychological impact outweighed the physical damage. In war, perception shapes reality, and the perception forming in the minds of Japanese sailors was simple. The night no longer belonged to them. The clash between innovation and survival was intensifying. What began as improvisation was becoming doctrine, and the next encounters would test whether these devil boats could truly dominate the dark. The transformation of the PT boats was not driven by admirals in distant headquarters. It came from junior officers and enlisted men who made decisions under fire, often without permission, and always without certainty. Lieutenants commanding PT boats operated with remarkable autonomy. Once they left base, radio silence was common, and engagement decisions were theirs alone. In that isolation, leadership became deeply personal. A single wrong call could kill everyone aboard. A single moment of hesitation could allow an enemy convoy to escape. Some officers resisted the changes at first. Naval doctrine still valued torpedoes and formal engagement rules, but the realities of night combat stripped away hesitation. Officers who saw their boats outrun, outgunned, or ignored by the enemy quickly understood that adaptation was survival. Commanders who embraced modification earned loyalty. Crews trusted leaders who fought for better weapons, who accepted risk alongside them, who allowed experimentation rather than clung to manuals written for another ocean. This trust mattered when darkness erased hierarchy and fear crept in. Leadership on PT boats was intimate. Officers slept feet from their men. They ate the same rations, endured the same heat, and faced the same incoming fire. Authority came not from rank insignia, but from competence under pressure. When the 37mm guns proved effective, commanders had to make hard calls, sacrifice torpedoes for guns, speed for stability, doctrine for instinct. Many chose survival. And those choices reshaped how the war was fought in the littoral zones of the Pacific. With heavier guns mounted, PT boat tactics evolved rapidly. The emphasis shifted from hit-and-run torpedo strikes to close-range ambush warfare. Crews learned to use coastlines as cover, hugging mangrove-lined shores and slipping through narrow channels that larger vessels could not navigate. Engines were throttled down to reduce wake and noise. Lookouts strained to identify silhouettes against the darker shoreline rather than the open sea. When contact was made, engagements were swift. A single burst from a 37mm cannon could decide the outcome in seconds. Boats would fire, turn sharply, and vanish into darkness before enemy gunners could react. This hit-and-fade approach exploited confusion. Japanese crews often could not determine how many attackers there were or where the shots originated. By the time they returned fire, the attackers were gone. PT crews also learned restraint. Firing too long meant inviting return fire or revealing position to shore batteries. Discipline replaced bravado. Every engagement became a calculation of risk versus necessity. These tactics required constant adaptation. Sea state, moonlight, shoreline contours, all influenced decisions. The boats became extensions of the environment itself, moving like predators that understood their terrain. Unlike high-altitude bombing or long-range naval gunfire, PT boat warfare was intimate. Crews saw the faces of those they fought. They heard voices. Sometimes they heard screams. This proximity carried a psychological cost. There was no abstraction of distance. Victory was immediate and personal. So was loss. Some crewmen spoke of hesitation after their first engagement, haunted by the knowledge of what their shells had done. Others hardened quickly, compartmentalizing fear and guilt to function. There was no time for reflection during patrols. That came later, if at all. Yet even in this brutality, there were moments of humanity. PT crews occasionally rescued survivors, enemy or allied, when circumstances allowed. These acts were rarely recorded, overshadowed by the violence of the campaign. War at sea had always been impersonal. The PT war was not. It demanded moral resilience as much as technical skill. And as the months passed, the line between hunter and hunted blurred. The Japanese adapted. New countermeasures appeared. The night grew more dangerous for everyone. All of it built toward a turning point. A moment when these improvised gunboats would face their greatest test. The night that defined the gunboats did not announce itself with ceremony. It arrived like most others. Humid, oppressive, and thick with the smell of mangroves and fuel oil. Somewhere off the coast of New Georgia, in the late summer of 1943, a small group of PT boats idled in darkness, engines barely breathing. The moon was thin, offering little light. The shoreline was a black mass, broken only by the faint glow of distant jungle fires, where Japanese troops cooked rice or burned waste to keep insects away. This stretch of water had become a corridor of desperation. Japanese forces on Kolombangara and surrounding islands were starving. American air power ruled the daylight sky. Supply runs could only happen at night, by barge, hugging the coast, moving slow and silent. For weeks, PT boats had hunted them, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. But this night was different. One of the boats carried a weapon that had already earned a reputation among its crew. A short, thick-barreled cannon sat forward, bolted into the deck with reinforced braces. It was not elegant. It did not belong there. But everyone aboard knew what it could do. The order came quietly. Engines advanced. The boats fanned out, maintaining distance, but keeping visual contact through practice hand signals and shadow movement. Lookouts leaned forward, eyes burning from strain. Then, a shape. Low, angular, wrong against the waterline, a barge. Then another. And another. They were loaded. Heavy in the water, vulnerable, the lead PT boat adjusted course, easing closer. At less than 300 yards, the first muzzle flash erupted, not from the enemy, but from the American boat. The 37mm cannon roared. The recoil shuddered through the hull. Deck plates rattled. The shell crossed the distance in a blink and struck the lead barge just above the waterline. The explosion tore through wood and steel alike, throwing debris into the air. A second shot followed immediately, then a third. The night exploded into chaos. Japanese gunners returned fire blindly, tracers slashing across the water. Machine gun rounds snapped overhead. But the PT boats were already moving, accelerating into darkness, then circling back at a new angle. Another burst, another impact. One barge burned fiercely, its cargo igniting in violent flashes. Another slewed sideways, dead in the water. Men jumped overboard, others clung to wreckage. This was no longer harassment. It was annihilation. The engagement lasted minutes. not hours. When it ended, the PT boats withdrew as quickly as they had come, engines screaming as they vanished into the maze of islands behind them. The water burned. For the first time, Japanese survivors reported a weapon they could not explain. Not torpedoes, not bombs, something heavier, something that struck with precision and vanished before retaliation. Word traveled fast along the coast. The Americans had changed the rules. That night was not unique, but it was pivotal. Similar engagements unfolded across the Solomons and New Guinea throughout late 1943 and early 1944. PT squadrons armed with heavy guns began to dominate the narrow seas. Japanese supply efforts faltered. Garrisons went hungry. Reinforcements failed to arrive. The tactical balance shifted, but the cost was not negligible. The same modifications that made PT boats lethal also made them fragile. Added weight strained engines and frames. Recoil loosened fittings. Crews worked constantly to keep their boats seaworthy. And as Japanese defenses adapted, adding shore guns, mines, and ambush points, the danger escalated. One misjudged turn, one unseen obstacle, one lucky shot. Losses mounted quietly. In some engagements, PT boats were hit and burned within seconds. Survivors swam for shore or disappeared beneath the waves. There were no grand announcements, no headlines, just missing boats and empty bunks. Yet the missions continued, because the effect was undeniable. Japanese barge traffic slowed to a crawl. Entire supply routes were abandoned. Commanders rerouted men inland, forcing grueling overland marches through jungle and disease. In some sectors, starvation claimed more lives than combat. The gunboats had done what air power alone could not. They strangled the enemy at night. And in doing so, they changed the rhythm of the campaign. But this escalation carried consequences beyond the immediate battlefield. As the Japanese adapted and Allied commanders pushed their small craft harder, the line between hunter and hunted blurred even further. The next phase would test whether these devil boats could survive the very chaos they had unleashed. By early 1944, the war in the Southwest Pacific had entered a new phase. The front was no longer defined by massive naval clashes or island invasions alone, but by a grinding contest of endurance along coastlines and narrow seas. The PT boats, once experimental, now essential, were being asked to do more with less. Their success had drawn attention. Japanese commanders began adapting with grim efficiency. Shore batteries were repositioned to cover known PT operating areas. Barges were fitted with heavier machine guns. Decoy runs were staged to lure patrols into ambushes. The night, once a sanctuary, became increasingly lethal. One engagement off the coast of New Guinea illustrated how narrow the margin had. BECOME, a division of PT boats, was tasked with intercepting a suspected supply movement near a river delta. Intelligence was incomplete. The coastline was unfamiliar. The moon, nearly full, cast long reflections on the water, beautiful and deadly. As the boats approached, the first shots did not come from the barges. They came from shore. Heavy machine gun fire erupted from concealed positions among the trees. Tracers stitched the water. One PT boat took hits to the engine compartment and slowed instantly, smoke pouring from its stern. The others reacted on instinct. A gunboat swung hard, bringing its 37 mm to bear. The first shell tore through the foliage, detonating against a hidden gun emplacement. The second struck closer to the waterline, silencing another position. But the brightness of each shot gave away its position. The return fire intensified. In the chaos, one boat grounded on a sandbar. Engine screamed as the crew tried to reverse. Another boat moved into cover, raking the shoreline with cannon fire. The noise was deafening, a rolling thunder trapped between jungle and sea. For minutes, the engagement teetered on collapse. Then discipline took over. The grounded boat freed itself. Smoke screens were laid. Engines surged. The formation withdrew. Battered but intact, they had destroyed multiple enemy positions, but the cost was evident. Hulls were scarred. Men were wounded. The margin between success and catastrophe had narrowed to inches. This was the new reality. The Japanese were no longer surprised. They expected the devil boats, and they were ready. Yet even under these conditions, the strategic effect remained undeniable. Every engagement forced the enemy to divert manpower, ammunition, and attention. Every disrupted supply run weakened frontline units already stretched thin. By mid-1944, Allied intelligence reports noted a sharp decline in Japanese coastal movement in several sectors. Some garrisons were effectively isolated, surviving on dwindling rations. Others attempted risky overland treks through malaria-infested jungles, suffering enormous losses without ever encountering the enemy. The PT boats, small and expendable on paper, had achieved what larger forces could not: control of the night. But success carried a toll beyond statistics. The crews were exhausted. Boats were worn to the edge of collapse. The men knew their luck would not last forever. Replacement hulls arrived slowly. Spare parts were scarce. Each patrol felt heavier than the last. And as the broader war shifted toward major offensives, Leyte, the Philippines, the push toward Japan, the role of the PT boats began to change once more. Their moment of dominance was ending. But before they faded into the background of history, they left an imprint on the war that could not be erased. An imprint carved into coastlines, supply lines, and the memories of those who fought in the dark. And in the wake of that transformation came consequences, strategic, psychological, and human, that would linger long after the guns fell silent. When the tempo of the Pacific War shifted in late 1944, the legacy of the PT gunboats was already written into the coastline. Their contribution could not be measured in tonnage sunk or territory seized. It was measured in absences, in convoys that never arrived, in garrisons that withered in isolation, in enemy plans quietly abandoned because the night no longer offered safety. In official after-action reports, the language was restrained. Terms like harassment, interdiction, and disruption appeared repeatedly. But behind those words lay a sustained pressure that reshaped entire sectors of the campaign. Japanese commanders acknowledged it indirectly. Intercepted communications and post-war testimonies described increasing difficulty in maintaining coastal supply routes. Barges were destroyed faster than they could be replaced. Crews refused assignments. Fuel shortages worsened. Units that were supposed to fight simply dissolved under hunger and disease before they ever met Allied troops. The PT boats had forced an operational shift. Instead of using the sea, once the Empire's greatest advantage, the Japanese were forced inland, into terrain that favored neither speed nor logistics. Movement became slower, more dangerous. Supply lines stretched and snapped. Entire regiments were reduced to scavenging. From the Allied perspective, the impact was subtle but profound. Fewer enemy troops reached the front lines. Fewer counterattacks materialized. Air and ground operations encountered weakened resistance. The boats themselves, however, paid a price. By 1944, many PT squadrons were operating vessels well past their intended lifespan. Wooden hulls warped and leaked. Engines suffered constant breakdowns. Spare parts were scavenged from wrecks or cannibalized from boats to damage to sail. Crews were rotated, but experience was irreplaceable. Veterans left with scars both visible and unseen. New arrivals learned quickly, or not at all. The psychological toll was significant. Prolonged night operations, constant adrenaline, and the intimacy of close combat left deep impressions. Some men struggled with sleep long after the war. Others carried a persistent sense of hypervigilance. The silence after the engines shut down could be as unsettling as the combat itself, and yet, among the exhaustion, there was pride. PT crews knew they had altered the course of the fight in ways no grand fleet maneuver ever could. They had taken a small, imperfect tool and bent it to the will of necessity. The Japanese, too, took lessons from the experience. Post-war analyses emphasized the vulnerability of supply lines and the dangers of underestimating small, mobile forces. The Devil boats entered naval lore, not as a technical marvel, but as a reminder of how quickly the character of war could change. As the war drew closer to its end, the role of the PT boat diminished. Larger operations demanded different assets. Air power dominated. Amphibious landings reshaped the battlefield, but the legacy of those small boats remained etched into the campaign. They had proven that innovation did not require perfection, only courage, adaptability, and the will to act when doctrine failed, and that legacy would echo long after the engines fell silent. As the Pacific War moved toward its final chapters, the world's attention shifted to massive fleet engagements, island invasions, and the looming shadow of the atomic age. In that vast machinery of destruction, the PT boats faded from headlines, but their influence endured quietly, embedded in doctrine, memory, and the men who had fought from their decks. By late 1944 and early 1945, many PT squadrons were reassigned or disbanded. Some boats were converted again, stripped of weapons, used for transport, reconnaissance, or training. Others were simply abandoned where they sat, their wooden hulls to warn to justify the cost of repair. A few were lost not to enemy fire, but to storms, rot, or mechanical failure. The war had moved on, yet among naval planners, the lessons were unmistakable. The Pacific Campaign had proven that speed, adaptability, and localized dominance could rival sheer firepower. The success of the gun-armed PT boats influenced post-war thinking about fast attack craft, coastal patrol vessels, and asymmetric naval warfare. Nations around the world would later develop missile boats and fast patrol ships built on similar principles: small platforms, heavy punch, tactical flexibility. The concept had been validated in blood and darkness for the men who served aboard these boats. The end of the war brought an uneasy transition. Many returned home carrying memories that did not fit into victory parades. Their war had been fought close, personal, and often unseen. There were no sweeping camera shots, no grand formations, just black water, engine noise, and flashes of violence. Some spoke of pride, of having mattered when it counted. Others spoke of loss, of friends who never came back, of nights that never truly ended. The boats themselves became symbols of a peculiar kind of courage, not the courage of massed armies, but of small crews willing to enter darkness with only each other for support. In Japan, reflection came more slowly. Post-war analysis acknowledged the effectiveness of a light coastal interdiction. Veterans recalled the fear of sudden destruction, of unseen enemies who struck and vanished. The psychological imprint lingered, shaping how naval thinkers approached literal warfare in the decades that followed. Over time, the devil boats became part of naval lore, not mythologized in the way of battleships or carriers, but respected for their brutal efficiency and the ingenuity behind them. Museums preserved a handful. Memoirs and oral histories captured fragments of their stories. Most, however, were left to decay in silence, their timbers returning to the sea. Yet their impact remained measurable. They had delayed enemy movements, starved garrisons, and forced strategic adjustments disproportionate to their size. They had demonstrated that innovation under pressure could alter the course of campaigns, and they had shown that in war, dominance often belongs not to the strongest, but to the most adaptable. As the Pacific War closed and the world exhaled, the legacy of the PT boats lingered quietly, not in monuments, but in lessons learned, lessons about speed, surprise, and the thin line between hunter and hunted. And those lessons would echo into every conflict that followed, long after the engines fell silent and the sea reclaimed the scars of war. The story of the devil boats lingered in the margins of history, not as legend, but as proof of what human adaptation can achieve under pressure. They were never meant to carry cannons. They were never designed to dominate battlefields. They were built for speed, not survival. And yet, when the war demanded something new, they became something else entirely. The men who served aboard them did not think in terms of doctrine or innovation. They thought in terms of getting through the night, of keeping the engines running, of watching the shoreline for movement, of trusting that the man beside them would not freeze when the first shot cracked the darkness open. Their victories were not measured in territory taken or flags raised. They were measured in quiet outcomes: a supply line cut, a garrison starved, an enemy forced to hesitate. Small changes, repeated night after night, until entire campaigns bent under their weight. History often celebrates the grand and the colossal, the carriers, the bombers, the invasions that reshaped continents. But war is also shaped by smaller instruments, by fragile hulls cutting through black water, by improvised weapons bolted into place by exhausted hands, by decisions made far from command rooms. The Devil boats were born of necessity, refined by fear, and sustained by resolve. They did not win the Pacific War alone, but they altered its texture. They proved that dominance could come from ingenuity as much as from power, and that adaptability could be as decisive as numbers. In the end, their greatest legacy may not be found in shipyards or archives, but in the quiet understanding they left behind, that in war, advantage often belongs to those willing to change first, and to those willing to face the dark with nothing but trust in one another, and the courage to act. The sea has long since erased their wakes, but their impact still ripples beneath the surface of history.